Hey everybody, if you have an agenda for today, please add to the meeting minutes. Right now I'm only seeing one thing on the agenda. Should we jump into that topic? Do we have enough people on that's around for that topic? Keith, what do you think?
We've got some of the folks here who submitted the doc, so I'd like to try to discuss as if we can to respect their time.
Yeah, that sounds good. I was hoping we could have more TOC member to join. Let me give them a ping because I remember there was a very lengthy discussion about this. Okay, at least John joined. I'll ping a few other members, see if they can join also. But let's go ahead. Sulin, why don't you kick off the discussion?
Yeah, sure. So back in August of last year, I introduced this suggestion to add match expression to destination rule. And I think that in the last meeting, there was some discussion about whether or not this works in ambient, which may affect whether or not we can contribute it for Istio. So should I give an overview of the feature or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, right. And maybe I'll rely on you, Keith, to talk a bit about why this doesn't work for ambient, at least not right now. Okay.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. So essentially, in destination rule and in a lot of places, I guess in the Istio and Kubernetes CRDs, you can use label selectors to select a subset of pods to be in a group. But there is also a more advanced selector that you can use called match expression, which you can use like not equals operators. I think there is a greater than or less than symbol as well. And I forget if these operators get stacked as an or and, but essentially it's more powerful than just label selectors. We wanted to use this because in our service mesh, which we are migrating from our custom control plane to Istio, we did allow a lot of complex failover scenarios. So we needed to also have the concept of priority 0, priority 1, etc. endpoints within the cluster. And the other thing is that we needed to be able to take certain priorities out of service discovery, even if they're not healthy, like a manual removal from the service discovery. So the way that I thought would be easiest to do that is via labels and manipulating what is in the content of the subset, rather than introducing like something where there's like a remote health check controller. I think there was also a bit of a mix-up in August where during this meeting, everybody in the meeting seemed to be very agreed to this idea. And I was not very well versed in the processes here. So I thought that was an agreement. I went ahead and started working on this during the Christmas break. And I think now there's a question as to how this might work for ambient. Keith?
Yep, I can explain that bit. So today, when you're using sidecars and you want to do routing, failover, and such, you can use something called subsets. Subsets are sort of an Envoy primitive. It's a way to sub-select certain endpoints within a single Envoy cluster. You can think about that as Istio service. This feature would allow you to be able to have to set your subsets, your Envoy subsets with different criteria than just a label selector. On the ambient side, with ambient, we really try to push. In fact, we only support at beta or higher gateway API style resources and gateway API style services and matching. Gateway API does not support subsets. It's a Envoy only concept, and so the Kubernetes way of doing this sort of failover selection is to create different services with different selectors, and then have and then send traffic to those different services from your client. Is sort of how you would handle the subsetting thing generally. So even if you, yeah, so that's the disconnect, is that in the world of ambient, and in the world of gateway API generally, there is no such thing as having like a match expression for a service. There's also no such thing as sub-selecting different endpoints within a service outside of creating a separate service. So you sort of have two different paradigms in tension here. And from a TOC perspective, what we're hoping to try to do from a policy perspective, in order to keep the code base maintainable and to reduce user confusion, is to only add new features that can be added to both ambient and sidecars. And that's sort of our conundrum here, because this feature, as currently expressed in the design doc, can only work in sidecars and not with Gateway API, because it relies on a kind of Envoy / Istio API specific feature, which is subsets. Does that sort of make sense to everybody generally?
Yeah, the other thing, so very sorry we didn't provide this feedback early in August. What Keith described does make sense to me. I just want to add in a couple of things on how the community operates. So typically, when you present a design doc to the community, we don't make the decision right away, especially if there involves the API change. So you get a preliminary read from the community, whether there's a strong objection or not. But we do require people to kind of sign up on the design doc. At least we want to at least have a couple of TOC member to sign up, because at the end, if you ever send a PR to Istio, the TOC would be the approval on the API change. So very sorry we kind of didn't bring the ambient perspective early on. And then the second thing I wanted to add is we've kind of also think through, Istio as a project, it's not, we don't add a feature just because one single user needs it, right? We actually have to looking at how many percentage of our user needs this function. So that's also have to take into factor. And for this particular one, we're interested to collect a little bit more data on who else needs such a function that, as you presented, who have similar problem as you presented. And as far as I know, we don't have that data yet, other than you need this.
Right. I can start a issue, and maybe people from Google can find it and add their plus ones. I did also in my RFC find a few places where people have mentioned that they desired something like this in the subset selector before. I also found an issue in the Kubernetes API where people wanted subset selectors for services, although I'm not sure how how easy it would be to implement that. Keith suggested that it would not be easy. So yeah, I can try to collect a few more community feedback for this as well. But I also think that if, I guess if moving to ambient requires people to create services that reflect their subset, is that an easy thing to do?
By the way, that's not a requirement moving to ambient. That's a requirement collectively made by the Kubernetes community working on defining the Kubernetes Gateway API, right? So if in order for people to be able to move to the Kubernetes Gateway API to continue to use the concept of subset, they would have to define a different version. I believe we can document that pretty extensively in our doc. So let me find something offline. So this is not directly related to Ambient. I just want to make sure it's a Kubernetes Gateway API thing, and Istio as implementation, implementing the spec. We just try to honor what the spec describes.
I see. So maybe it sounds like I should try to collect feedback from the Istio community and the community working on the Gateway API.
Yes, I think that would be helpful. To Lynn's point, this is a general thing. We found, I think Ben Leggett actually posted the same Kubernetes issue that you sent me, Shulim, around people wanting to do this in Kubernetes. Again, I want to be clear. It's not necessarily that we couldn't do it in Kubernetes. More so that changes to Kubernetes take an extraordinarily long time, somewhere on the order of 2 years to really be available. And that's typically not feasible for most feature requests coming from users. So I do try to just caveat that in discussing changes to Kubernetes. I do think that this brings up an interesting point to me that I don't think we've discussed in the community in the past when it comes to failover specifically. And I think that we have, some fundamental, potentially some fundamental tension when it comes to how Envoy works and the Kubernetes standard of creating separate services. So my understanding is that with Envoy, your failover and your routing and your circuit breaking is on a per cluster basis. Cluster being the Envoy cluster, a set of endpoints. And so subsets that we talked about earlier in Envoy, all the functionality for failover and stuff work for subsets because those are all within a single cluster. However, in Istio, and generally every other Envoy-based gateway that I know of, Kubernetes services, each Kubernetes service is its own cluster. It's its own Envoy cluster. And so my understanding, I could might just not know all the details here, but my understanding is that Envoy does not support failing over from one cluster to another cluster. Maybe it does, but if it doesn't, then I think that represents something a bit more fundamental than just what spec do we want to tie ourselves to as a community. Now we're talking about a feature gap where things, how is failover going to be possible in the same way that it is in ambient versus sidecar? Again, it might not be that case. I might be missing something, but a brief look makes me a bit worried about that.
Hey, sorry. I was catching half of this on captions. So I just wanted to clarify something. Are you saying that with destination role subsets, it's all one cluster in Envoy, so that behaves differently than using services as subsets, which is multiple clusters?
That's my understanding. It could be wrong.
No, Istio subsets. Well, so there's Envoy subsets and Istio subsets. Istio doesn't implement Istio subsets with Envoy subsets. It implements them by having distinct clusters. So there's no difference from Envoy standpoint of using Istio subsets and using multiple services as a subset.
Oh, okay. That makes me a lot less concerned. So in theory, like, we could do the exact same thing and just have it in multiple services instead.
Yeah, the only difference would be that the name would be like outbound pipe, as in no subset name there, because the subset's part of the name, and then different host name, whereas with subsets it would be like outbound pipe, subset name, pipe, host name. But that Envoy obviously doesn't care about the name.
Right. Okay. Okay. So I think that means there's actually a more of a path forward here, because instead of creating subsets with match expression, we have the potential to either create a resource that has match expression support if you really need the complexity of that. But even if just as a middle ground, you could potentially on your site create services for each one of your subsets and have your labels remain fairly static and create services for all the permutations of those labels that you want to match on. Does that make sense, Shulene?
I might have to follow up with you for some documentation. But if the idea is that an Envoy cluster can be multiple Kubernetes services, it's possible we can work with that. Maybe my one concern is like, does this work on the Istio API or only within the Gateway API?
In theory, there's nothing preventing destination rule is host name route matching, so it's going to route based on. It could work with some. It might. John, keep me honest here. It might work with some client changes because I think destination rule is changing it based on host name, which basically buzzes into a service. So you need to get creative with your service naming in order to get that to work fully. Am I understanding that correctly?
Like you need a destination rule for each subset, I think, maybe, or use like a wildcard, like for each subset service. Like with destination rule, to, like if you want a configuration, like I don't know, add TLS for a service day with subsets in Istio, you have one destination rule with one TLS config and then two subsets configured. But if you use services as subsets, now you have two distinct services which have two distinct destination rules configuring them.
You can't do like wildcards within a FQDN component in destination rule.
No, you can't do like foo dash wildcard.
Yeah.
You just do wildcard, so it's a bit less ergonomic.
But in theory, Shulene, the scenario that you lay out in the doc is you want to remove a let's say a region from service discovery, right? From the routing. So to remove it from the routing, what you would do is to, what would the client be calling? So you'd have, that's a bit more complicated actually, because the client calls. I mean, one option is to delete the service. Yeah, one option is just to delete the service that's selecting. So if you've got three services, one that selects all the pods regardless of region, one service for region 1 and service for region 2, and you have a destination rule. Oh, at the virtual service level, I forgot about that part. Yeah, so at the virtual service level, you would change. Instead of routing to all the services, you would route only to service 2, or route evenly across regions 1 and 3, but not 2. It's a bit cumbersome, but I think it'll work.
I think this is actually one of the alternatives I laid out in the RFC doc. Like if we don't have something like match expression, what we can do is create a bunch of labels that describe like every scenario of every combination of regions that could possibly be active. And we will have more than 2 regions. So that combination becomes like very large at some point, but I think there's no limit to how many labels you can create. So maybe that's fine.
I think what I'm suggesting is slightly different. So instead of having labels that describe the combinations, your labels would stay static, right? You would never change your labels on your, because I think that was one of the core requirements, right? You don't want to change the labels on your pods because that could cause some churn, just not great, right? So labels stay static. Your labels just describe, what you do need your labels that describe all the things that you might want to match on. So if it's region, you have a region label. If it's zone, you have a zone label. If it's a color, you've got a color label. And then what you would do is in your virtual service for your clients would your clients would send traffic to a service that matched everything. And in the case where you want to remove a particular, let's say, region from load balancing, you would need to change your virtual service, and you would need to change your virtual service to essentially remove. Okay, I can sketch this out right quick actually. So you have a virtual service that has that routes traffic evenly across all 4 regional services. Let's say there are 4 regions, evenly across all 4 regional services that you create. If you want to remove a region from load balancing, you would remove that service from the virtual service backend route. So your labels never change. You just modify the virtual service instead of modifying the destination rule. And we can support something similar with the gateway API style of routing. So you see, we've got destination. You've got there's host, but you can also do a per service destination. So you would have like have X number of destinations depending on however many regional services you create. And then whenever you want to remove a region or whatever the criteria is, you just remove that from your load balancing. It gets a bit complicated, I won't lie, when it comes to like different permutations. So like if you have a virtual service based on region, but you want to remove a particular zone from load balancing, then I've got to change virtual service to route to zonal services. But basically, whatever granularity that you might want to match traffic on, like whatever granularity that you want to route based on, make that the number of services you create. Have a virtual service that routes to all of those backend services evenly. When you want to remove one or many, remove them from the destination, move those destinations from the virtual service. I think that gets you about the same result as the match expression, albeit with a little bit more work.
Got it. Yeah, I think we did explore this option. It just didn't take into account the failover scenario. But I'll talk a bit about this with my team to see if we can come up with an alternative. I'm more interested in this concept of Kubernetes services, like multiple of them being in the same Envoy cluster. I'm curious to see like how that works in the Gateway API as well as the Istio API, but it might be a bit difficult to talk about verbally. So if I could talk about it on Slack or ask about it on Slack, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. We've got the networking channel on Slack. Feel free to put it there, and we can talk about it. And I can maybe be a bit more eloquent with specific virtual services or resources that we can sketch out.
Sounds great. I'm also curious. In Slack, Keith, you and I talked about the possibility of a match expression like feature in the Gateway API. Is that still possible, or was that just something else?
Great question. So I actually asked this in the Gateway API Slack channel, and it was received fairly well. In the sense that the community members want to support more backend than just service, and so something like a generic subset resource or something like that that does a match expression across multiple endpoints would be feasible. I'm curious to explore that.
Okay, great. I'll follow up. I think like one alternative that I will suggest to my team is that if we think the match expression idea is still feasible for a subset, Like we can contribute it ourselves to our own internal fork and just wait for it to be merged in the open source version. I mean, it makes our Istio upgrades really complicated. But depending on the timeline, if it's still feasible, we could also do something like that to speed up something that we need. But yeah, I'll keep that as an option.
Yeah, sounds good. There's still some discussion I think we need to have on a lot of our failover functionality in Envoy and making sure that our APIs allow you to use that functionality across different Kubernetes services versus Istio subsets. Like John said, it's possible from an Envoy config perspective. I just want to make sure that need to make sure our APIs expose that capability in some way. So let's please continue to follow up. Again, I really appreciate you bringing this forward. To bit of a tough problem, but always appreciate contributors who are willing to put together a design doc and write code. I want to do what we can to make sure that we can help you be successful.
Thanks. And like I said, we are going to have more regions, more. We're going to break down our clusters also within the region. So there's going to be more cases of failover that my organization will have to deal with. So if there's anything the community is interested in about our use case that we can give to kind of like influence the failover design in Istio, I'd be happy to share our use cases. Maybe I'll also close off this topic with I did reread the README of how to contribute, and from the README, it was not quite clear exactly like the steps to go through. So I would also request that maybe the README is updated to include the full process for how to get features approved.
Absolutely. I will take that as an action item myself and try to get that updated this week.
Are you referring to the contributing the MD file? I assume.
Yeah, I think this is the one that I looked at. I think it got to the part where you can write a design doc.
Yeah.
And then it also says, from my memory, I'm not reading it right now, that you post on Slack that the design doc was written, but it did not say exactly who needed to approve it and what process to go through.
Yeah, thank you for calling that out. Yeah, I agree. It wasn't super clear. All right, thank you so much for bring back the design doc and everything and bring back the discussion. Thank you, Keith, for help leading this portion of the discussion. Do we have any other topics we want to discuss? I assume it's a good time to wrap up with this discussion. Great. All right, I'm not seeing anything on the agenda. Should we give you guys some time back, and we'll see you in 25 minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Bye all.
All right, bye.